Shout It Out Loud, A Story of Kiss's Destroyer and the Making of an American Icon. Quite a title, but let me tell you, having almost finished this book really puts you in that world of 1975 when Kiss made what many consider to be their finest ever studio record. And the author that captured it all in this book is James Campion, and he joins us right now live on the phone line. Hey, James, how are you, man?
Eddie, it's an honor, man. Thank you for having me on.
Sure thing, and congrats on the book. It really is a hell of an undertaking, and I guess the obvious first question would be, why did you pick Destroyer, and why did you pick this topic? I'm assuming you're a big Kiss fan?
I am. I guess you could say that. I mean, I'm 53 now, so it just took me back to a time that really meant a lot to me. It was a labor of love. It was a lot of work. Took 3 years of my life, many, many interviews. Tried to get everything I could into the book. And it's very nice of you to say that you enjoyed it. You're on my Mount Rushmore of people I wanted to impress with it. But I wanted to make sure the real, true Kiss fans who really, really know about this and have a great nostalgic feeling for the band, that they were served. And it was a great period of time for music and especially, obviously, for Kiss. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, and listen, that's the thing. And I've recommended the book to a lot of people since I started to get into it. My biggest problem is with books is I just don't have that much time to read them because there's so many of them out there now. And unlike a record where you can put it on in the background, a book you have to absorb. You have to take time with it. And having started to get into this book, all my friends that are Kiss fans, I've said to them, man, if you're hardcore like I am and so many others are, this is a must because, I mean, there's not a stone unturned capturing this era of the band. Was Destroyer your first Kiss record, James?
No, it was Alive. I got that for my 8th grade graduation, I remember, but I remember it was the first Kiss record that I actually saved up for and got. I had gotten it in the summer, so it had been out a couple of weeks. And it's just one of those records with the cover and the opening scene sequence that Bob Ezrin did so brilliantly and everything that went into it. The record, I mean, it's so great you just played Flaming Youth. While you were playing that and I was on hold, it just took me back to standing in like an area waiting for my parents who are actually listening to me right now in North Carolina and waiting for them to pick me up and singing the song over and over again in my head when I was like 13, 14 years old. And that's what writing this book and listening to that record, it takes me right to that time period. And I learned so much I love the idea of how people put together anything, right? It's a film or a record, but especially back in the 70s when everything was analog and had to create these sounds. There was no Pro Tools, where they put a mic, where they put a drum set, how they used different, the studio like an art form, like it's a palette, as I call it in the book. So it wasn't just about Kiss, it was like all these people who worked organically to make them what I say is an American icon.
Well, yeah, and that's a great point because you gather, this book is put together from a lot of different sources, it seems like. There's a lot of archival stuff, but there are also new interviews. And people that know anything about how a record is truly made, especially back in those days where, as you said, there wasn't the computer programs and all that sort of thing, the people that really have the stories and can give you the real insights are not necessarily the marquee names. They're really the guys that worked in the trenches on the records, the engineers, the mix people, the assistant engineers, the mastering guys, of course, the producer. And what was really impressive about what you did with this book is you got all those guys. You have fresh interviews with all those guys that really worked on these records, this record, the engineers and everybody. How did you go about finding all those guys?
Well, it was just, it was just straight up journalism work. That's what I do. And it was just finding numbers and getting contacts and another guy who knows another guy. And I write a column and I'm a managing editor of the Aquarian Weekly, which I know you advertise in New Jersey and New York. And they help me, get contacts. But the big one for me, and I always joke about this, but it's true, and I tell Bob all the time now because we've kind of become friendly, that Bob Ezrin was my Wizard of Oz. If I didn't get Bob, I didn't feel like there's, because half the story is Bob. Bob's work with Alice Cooper and what Kiss saw in that and what Bob had seen in Kiss, and he brought the pathos and all that stuff to them. So when I finally got Bob, which is about 16 months in the making, that's when everything kind of coalesced. But it's really great because especially the old Record Plant guys, because they recorded Destroyer, except for the Beth and the Great Expectations backing tracks, which they did at the old A&R studios on 54th Street, which was the old Columbia studios. But the Record Plant, which is on 44th in Hell's Kitchen, where they recorded hundreds of great seminal albums. All those guys are such a great little intergroup, and they have their own Facebook page. So once I got infused into that little group, then I really started to learn a lot about the way records are made then, and especially Destroyer, which I think has, and I should ask you, Eddie, I think Destroyer has a specific sound that Kiss never really recreated prior or afterwards.
No, I would agree completely with that. And it's interesting, for me, Destroyer was my first Kiss record. And as many people know, Kiss was my gateway into all of this world of rock music for the most part. I was into a band before them called the Raspberries, but the first band that I really became consumed with at every level was Kiss, and it was my only band for a couple years. But you talk about how listening to those records bring you back. I tell the story all the time, and I didn't even remember it, James, to be honest with you, but until I read the book that you had actually emailed me when you were making it, and I have a little blurb in the book, which I forgot that I had told you, but I remember vividly, I was in junior high school, and I'm walking home through my hometown, and I would pass by the same record store every day, and my friend said to me, I'm going to go and buy this new record by this band Kiss, and the new record at that time was Rock and Roll Over, the album after Destroyer. And I remember him saying to me, this one's new, I haven't heard it yet, you should get the one before it, that one I have, and it's great. And that's how I first got Destroyer. And the same thing, getting home, looking at the cover, dropping the needle, the intro to Detroit Rock City, and it was game over. And what your book does so well is it puts you in that time, and you cover everything from the record jacket to talking to the people who worked on the artwork. I mean, the detail you paid to this is really, really remarkable. It really, really was a hell of a read.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Yes, those are the stories I got the biggest kick out of. It's just talking to Ken Kelly, who painted that iconic cover. And Ken sent me this beautiful drawing and said, good luck with the book, which I have hanging in my living room right now. Just how Dennis Wallach, who was in charge of all their creative stuff, how he got Ken Kelly. He couldn't get, Frazetta, who was really big, who did the Conan covers and the Vampirella, and how Ken had never done anything like this before, and how he had to go back to his one-room apartment and draw from these little slides, this thing that we all looked at and loved as kids, and the creativity behind it, and how much Ken appreciated someone calling him up and getting to tell the story again, and how much that meant to him and has changed his life. And this record really did change the fortunes of dozens of people, and they're very, very upfront about it, and we're very, very enthused to talk about it. When I dove into this originally, I did it because I was always fascinated by Destroyer, always was. But once I started to talk to these other people, I realized I had to get the stories right, because these people did put forth their best efforts and to make this great. And many people don't know the names, but I'm hoping that they will now.
Well, yeah, and the part where you talked to, where I gave you a paragraph, and I think Scott Ian and some of these other guys talking about the impact this record had on
right, and
them.
Thank you for that.
Well, thanks for including me. Honestly, I forgot that I did it because I'm reading the book. I'm like, oh, I'm in this. I totally spaced on it, but it's interesting perspective there, because I never really thought about it. If I wasn't walking home from school that day and my friend didn't tell me about this band called Kiss, and I didn't buy Destroyer as my first real proper hard rock record, I don't know. I don't know if I would have gone rock crazy and spent my whole life in the music industry. There's plenty of musicians that will tell you they wouldn't have picked up a guitar if it wasn't for Ace, or a drumstick if it wasn't for Peter, or whatever, bass if it wasn't for Gene. So that's an interesting point. You just don't know whether it's somebody like me who ended up, going in more of a media direction or working in the business, or whether it's a musician, or whether it's someone like you as a journalist. You don't know where it's going to come from, and how an album so impactful like this has resonated with so many people.
Yeah, and I'm always inspired by it. I'm not just saying this because I'm on your show, but it's true. I'm always inspired by, either on your TV show, that metal show, or any of your writings. or some of the stuff that I've heard of you on the radio, you always bring an intellectual slant to everything. You always give it a greater sensitivity than many other parts of the media or people look at it. And that I kind of approach the book that way, to give it its due. Yeah, sure, it has that wonderful sense of nostalgia for us kids who grew up with that stuff and how it changed our lives or expanded. As I said to Bob Ezra, I said, you have no idea how much you expanded our imagination with The Wall and all those things. I mean, I know you were doing art and getting paid for it, but it really meant a lot to us. So I wanted to give Kiss, I'm not saying, believe me, I got close to a lot of guys who wrote Kiss books. Ken Sharp, who's fantastic, Jeff Suz, but and they all agreed that no one had ever done a book like this about Kiss, giving them their due. There's plenty of books about the Beatles like this and everything else, and I felt like it needed to be done, and I'm glad I was able to do it. And it's great to hear feedback from someone like yourself, like I said, who has put a higher plane on this music.
Well, thanks. I mean, that's always what it's been about for me, is to try to give it a little more respect than a lot of people kind of give it. And the thing with this book, you talk to so many people, but the people you don't talk to as far as new interviews are any of the four guys that made Destroyer, Gene, Peter, Paul, or Ace. I'm assuming you tried, or did you rather just tell the story from others?
I did try, and I remember bugging you about it too, because I know you're close to Ace and Peter. When I first started the book in 2011, more or less, just to start the research, I contacted everybody. I had done a cover story for the Aquarian, in fact, on Paul Stanley's Live to Win. So I got to know Paul's people, and Paul is very nice, and I actually asked him quite a few questions about Destroyer. After we got off the phone, off the record, I used some of those quotes in the book. But Ace was working on his memoir, which was coming out. Peter was the same thing. So they stonewalled me a little bit, and I understand that. They wanted their story to be their story. And, of course, Gene and Paul are very protective. If they're not, they don't have their stamp on it. If it's not authorized by them, they're very, very careful. And I understand that, but I wanted this to be a history book. I didn't want this to be a Kiss imprimatur book where they give their thumbs up and then they're kind part of the story. And also, a really close friend of mine helped me with the book and all the musical stuff in it, who's a librarian, and he told me, and he was a history major, and he told me a lot of these books that come out, when you talk to guys 40 years after the fact, they've already, the fish gets bigger. The story, there's always an embellishment, especially with Paul and Gene. So once I started to delve deeper and I started to get these stories and they kept stonewalling me, I thought, well, maybe it's best if I just quote the 26-year-old 1976 guys in the band instead of the guys now. And of course, you know it well, you've talked about it many, many times on your shows, just the rifts between them, having guys wearing the makeup now, which I'm with you on that one, the way that Peter and Ace feel with those guys now. So that was a really hard sources to mine. And eventually I had to, go or get off the pot. So I decided to forge ahead without them as far as new interviews.
Well, I think it actually works because you are telling a story here by people you don't normally hear from and hear their voice. And you're right. I mean, there's been a lot done on Kiss, nothing to this detail about one specific record of theirs, but you can almost... The Gene, Paul, Peter, or Ace today, you could almost pretty much anticipate what their answers and how they're going to answer some of this stuff. And right. You don't want to get involved in the he said, she said stuff. I mean, I know just recently, I think around the time of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a couple years ago, there was this blow up because there was this insinuation from Gene or Paul that Peter didn't have anything or much to do with Beth and the creation of Beth. And Beth is such a pivotal thing in the history of Destroyer, which you cover really well because who didn't want it on the record, who did, the resentment it caused when it became a hit, and their biggest song, and that whole thing is a sub-story in and of itself. But so by taking quotes from them back in the day and then surrounding it with information and interviews that are current from people you don't hear from all the time, it probably gave it a much more proper perspective, I would think.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think ultimately that the decision I made in there, and it was kind of hoisted upon me, it turned out to be the better thing for historical perspective on there. But it's funny because a lot of that stuff, that period was such a heady time for those guys. It happened so fast. And they do have revisionist history. And let's face it, they're the only band, as far as I know, they're the only band where all four members have memoirs. And I quoted from them copiously because they didn't give me interviews. And to be honest, Ace's people were really nice to me, and it looked like I was going to get through to him. But you make the point. I think I ultimately decided to do it because I didn't want to interview Ace and only get his side, and then not get Peter.
Well, that's just it. If you didn't get all four, it would kind of be it would be slanted. It would be wrong. Yeah.
Right, and then somebody would say, "Oh, this is just an Ace apologist because he gave him the thing." I didn't want it to be about that, so I tried to stay as objective as I possibly could.
There's so much great stuff, and again, I'm talking to James Campion. He's the author of Shout It Out Loud, A Story of Kiss's Destroyer and the Making of an American Icon, a super in-depth book, all covering that period of time where Kiss made what many feel to be as their definitive studio record of all time, and just the stuff that went all around it, from it being, there's so many elements to it, being the follow-up record to the breakthrough record with a live album. What people may not realize, and I didn't realize the magnitude of it, James, until I read this book, is the backlash at the time to this record being a very polished, produced record, being a Kiss record that had an organ in it and that a children's choir and that had all this production and all these things going on, that to the meat and potatoes Kiss fan, you even make reference that in its original first few weeks of release for Destroyer, there was so much backlash that there was talk of them even potentially pulling the record, and there was a lot of anger about it, right?
Yeah, no, that was one of the things, main things I learned. I learned a lot of things in this book. Obviously, Dick Wagner, the late Dick Wagner who passed, he gave me one of his final interviews that he ever gave. Kim Fowley, who just passed last year. But the two biggies for me was the fact that Kiss got Bob Ezrin and started to work on these songs and went through the famous boot camp, which I cover an entire chapter in the book, before Alive became big. The assumption always was, well, Alive came out, it made them big, they had to make Destroyer crazy and wild with, they had to go for the big Bob Ezrin move. But that wasn't necessarily true. When they got Bob, they were still desperate. They hadn't sold any records. Alive had not kicked off. In fact, there was a lawsuit that split the record in half the time they worked on it. But the second big one was after the record came out, they were, like you said, they were so afraid. There was such a backlash that Bill Aucoin, and Bob read me the letter over the phone, sent him a letter. He still has it, and he still feels terrible about it, although he has, mended the fences. He worked on Music from the Elder with Kiss and then Revenge later on. But they basically were going to go out and get somebody else to produce, Jack Douglas, who produced those great Aerosmith records, who Jack was a protege of Bob, and Bob was away on vacation when he got back. They were, because he thought he was going to be their producer the way he worked with Alice Cooper for years. And that's another thing that I never knew. People just figured it was a one-shot deal. So, yeah, it was such a backlash from all the places, because most people didn't Rolling Stone, everybody fobbed Kiss off anyway. But when Cream magazine and Circus magazine started to hammer them for losing their street cred, Kiss panicked. And that's why they ran back to Eddie Kramer, who had worked on the tapes for Alive, and they went back and recorded their next record virtually live instead of putting together another studio extravaganza. So, yeah, just the release of Destroyer, despite the fact that it did very well, better than any record they had done before, and Beth brought them back later that year, that was a big shockwave to Kiss. And it was at the edge of them either being a great band that we know today or a flash in the pan. So it's really a fascinating story.
Yeah, it really is, because you think about it, and until I read the book, I didn't really ever consider it, because, again, Destroyer was my first record. Then I went back and got Alive and got the originals and all that. But when you look at it in historical sense, you're talking about a band that before Destroyer had 3 studio albums that were very sort of, harshly, to some people's opinions, produced. I actually love the sound of Dress to Kill, but I'm probably in the minority on that. But,
I do too.
Hotter Than Hell is kind of a super compressed, sort of weird sounding record. And the first record sounds fine. It's not up to par, maybe some of the other stuff of 74, but it sounded fine to me. But still, very guitar, bass, drums, very sort of basic rock and roll, all great. And then this bombastic live album, which was just in your face, raw live record. And then this thing comes along, and it's like, I guess for me, I got this as my introduction and then went backwards. But for people who had been on board already, to get something like Destroyer, even though in retrospect it's considered this landmark record, was really a big shock. It was really what happened to My Kiss. This was a whole different thing.
Right, and I have the opposite. I'm with you. Destroyer, I thought, to me, wet my palate. I wanted more of the same. Then later on, when I went back and listened to the Alice Cooper stuff, I started to say, this is my game. This is the kind of thing. I love the imagination of this. I was disappointed when Rock and Roll Over came out, to be quite frank. I do love the sound of Dressed to Kill as well. I love the dead-sounding drums. I like the in-your-face guitars and bass of that record. But in the case of, for instance, Detroit Rock City, I think, the sound, the writing, the chord changes, the beautiful middle section, which is almost like an operatic aria, guitar parts, that thing is a masterpiece. And I just dare to say it. I don't think Kiss ever created anything as great as that.
Well, because if you read your book, and given credit where it's due throughout the book, it's Ezrin. I mean, people forget that Ezrin not only produced this record, but he played some stuff on it in terms of like piano or whatever, but he also co-wrote a lot of songs. This was the first Kiss record, if I'm not mistaken, that had outside writers, didn't it?
Yep.
Yeah,
yep.
So you had Kim Fowley, you had Ezrin. I think Ezrin probably has co-writes on at least half the record.
I'm surprised that many people, I've gotten a lot of people through our Facebook page we have for the book, which is a great little community for Kiss fans. I'm surprised a lot of the younger people did not know that King of the Nighttime World was a song by the Hollywood Stars, that it was not a Paul Stanley song.
Yeah, and that's exactly, and you cover that and the history of that song, and you even talk to those guys, I think, right? You get some quotes from them in there too. Yeah, which a lot of those guys are a little bitter about that. It's funny, that band was breaking up, and the story goes that, as Kim told me, that they, Bob basically said, I love this song, I don't like the band. If I ever need a song, give me this song. And to Kim Fowley's credit, because this guy was well connected in the music business for about 30 years before he even met Bob Ezrin. He remembered him, called him up, said, the Hollywood Stars are no more. What about this King of the Nighttime World? He said, this could be a great Kiss song, and bingo. Yeah, and you know what else too? I always I always wondered about with Destroyer, that's so just never understood it, never saw it credited, never saw it given a name or anything like that. And that is the last thing on it, that montage of noise, and you get into that a little bit in the book. You talk about that, and I think you even pulled a quote from what I did with Gene when those guys used to talk to me, 15 years ago or whatever, because I did remember I asked Gene about that a long time ago, and it still never was. I guess it was just done to put like an ending on of some sort. It's almost like to end a conceptual piece, right?
Right, and because the record was so short and they were gone at the time, and Bob got together, that was Jay Messina's idea, and I'm not going to get into the full scope of it here, but it's really, really cool because Jay took it from a basic track that he learned from other guys that were into this special kind of musical, I guess it's a technological way of creating music from sounds and tape loops. David Bowie had done it, King Crimson prior to that. But Jay Messina, the lead engineer who'd worked on all those great Aerosmith records, worked with John Lennon, it was his idea. And it's funny because he kept insisting to me that the thing was called Rock and Roll Demon. And isn't it on the record? You don't have the original. I said, I got the record when it first came out, Jay. It's not on here. Turns out, I got from one of the Kiss fans out there, an acetate. It was listed on the acetate when it left the record plant. So as far as Jay was concerned, when it left his hands, it was going to be on the record as Rock and Roll Demon, and it never did make it on there. So it was sort of that mysterious end noise track that the Beatles put at the end of Sgt. Pepper's that just keeps looping around.
Yeah.
So that was a really cool story in itself, too.
Yeah.
And many of the mysteries of this record, I love it.
Yeah, yep, for sure. And listen, we could talk about it forever, but the last thing that I think is interesting about Destroyer, there's so many things, but is the song God of Thunder, which there's hardcore Kiss fans will know this, but the more casual fans won't, that God of Thunder, which is the signature Gene Simmons song, live, spitting blood, breathing, doing the whole flying thing. I mean, just the iconic Demon Gene Simmons song was not written at all by Gene. It is a 100% sole right of Paul Stanley's. And you get into that in the book and you pull some quotes from back in that time. That was turned out when Ezrin said, when Paul brought that song in and Ezrin heard it and said, Gene's going to sing this, that was a real issue for Paul, huh? He was really pissed about that.
Yeah, and it's funny, too, because Gene has said, and even in his memoir, he's like, oh, that's a joke. That was Paul doing a Gene song. He said, I can write a Gene song, and that wasn't true. Paul had taken, Bob had gotten the guys together and said, I want everybody to have their own theme song. I want you to write songs that are based on your characters. Your characters. Paul, you're love, and Gene, you're the demon, and blah, blah, blah. And Paul came back with this God of Thunder, and he's talking about Aphrodite and loving and blah, blah, blah. But the way that riff went and some of the violent images that for some reason Paul Stanley put in there, it triggered something in Bob. And Bob went and said, this is the demon song. This is Gene's song. And yeah, Paul was really disappointed. And that's one of the things I want to say in closing. Even though this is as much of, it was a labor of love for me to get Bob's story out there, but the great Bob Ezrin, and he did write 7 of the 9 tracks, and he produced this brilliantly, and he really worked the guys. Everybody in the band, maybe for the first and last time, they all pulled together. You know that we always heard that Kiss thing, the Kiss myth of all for one. On this record, they really did. And you got Paul handing over God of Thunder. You got Ace Frehley handing sections of song to make Flaming Youth, and really allowing Dick Wagner. I know it's been back and forth, but for the most part, Ace succumbed and allowed Dick to play on some of the solos. You got them all stepping back, even though they argued, to allow Peter to have this song with just strings on it. All the stuff that went on in there, I think Kiss really pulled together, and I think that's why I feel it's their manifesto, not only as a band musically, but also their images and their message. So that's why I think Destroyer really works as a quintessential Kiss album.
Last thing, was there any hesitation from Ezrin in talking to you about it? Was he cool with from the get-go, or did you have to really sell him on the idea of doing this?
He loved the idea. He just didn't have any time. The guy's amazing. He was making a record with Deep Purple at the time. I think he's making something else now. He made, in the interim while I was talking to him, he was making that Welcome to My Nightmare 2, which Wagner was working on. That's how I got introduced to Bob, through Alice, who I'd done several interviews with, who's one of the sweetest guys you'll ever meet.
For sure.
And I'm sure you know that. And I talked to Alice for the Alice chapters for this book as well. But yeah, no, Bob was always into the idea. It's just he was just so damn busy. And when he did sit down, though, it just poured out of him. And he said to me, this was the most fun, the most interesting thing I did in my career at this period, which was his real salad days, and he wanted everyone to know that how much hard he worked and how much he loved those guys and loved making that record.
Yeah, it's you couldn't have done it without Ezrin, and he painted the picture perfectly, and the book is just phenomenal, man. So congrats on it. Again, it's called Shout It Out Loud, The Story of Kiss's Destroyer and the Making of an American Icon, written by James Campion, who's been nice enough to give us a few minutes here to talk about what I'm sure consumed a lot of hours in your life, man.
It sure did. Eddie, man, this has been a real thrill. Seriously, I'm a big fan, and I'm really, 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 really happy that you dug the book and you're singing its praises. It means a lot. I know I hit the bell if you're digging it.
No, I did, and I tweeted out a picture of it a while ago and told people to check it out, and I wanted to get you on for a few minutes. Like I said, I've got this big stack of books that I'm trying to get through, and it's funny because I've written a couple books myself, so I get it. People want to get out there and do interviews and promote them the minute they come out, but I hate talking to people until I've had a chance to read the book. It doesn't make any sense to me, and sometimes I'm a little late in my reading because of my schedule, but I'm glad I got to it, and I hope it does well for you, man.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Appreciate it, man. Thank you very much for a few minutes. I really appreciate it.
You got it, James. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye. There he is, James Campion, and again, shout it out loud. If you are a Kiss fan, it is a must, because there's just the detail he puts into this is really pretty admirable, and that's the thing too. It's very balanced. If he would have had one person or another, as far as the people who made the record in giving their story, you would have gotten probably very skewed to that person's side impression of what went on. But to go and get these older interviews and then surround it with all new interviews with people who actually worked on this record in so many different capacities, really cool stuff. All right, so, speaking of Destroyer, we talked about God of Thunder. I'll play it for you right now. One of the many classics from this album, and as we just said, who knew back in those days, a bit of a hot button, because it was a Paul Stanley song given to Gene Simmons, and a song that is iconic with Gene, but Gene had nothing to do with the writing of it. So here we go. God of Thunder. We'll do some music for about, 25, 30 minutes, and then I'll give you the last 20 or 30 of the show until 10 o'clock Eastern with your open phone. So sit tight on the calls. I'll let you know around 9:30, 9:40. We'll start taking your calls to the top of the hour when we wrap up this Monday edition of Eddie Trunk Live.